Okay, so when you think about the Apollo program, you probably picture this perfect, clean countdown to the moon, right? Apollo 1, Apollo 11. But hold on, what about Apollo 2? It's a mission that's just gone from the history books. And the story behind why it's missing is one I bet you've never heard.
I mean, it's a simple question, isn't it? You look at the mission list and it just isn't there. So, what happened? Was it a secret mission? Was it lost? The real answer is actually way more interesting, and it uncovers this hidden, absolutely critical part of the whole race to the moon.
So the sequence starts off logically enough with Apollo 1. Makes sense. But then, bam, nothing. Just this big blank space where you'd expect to see Apollo 2 and 3. The program just suddenly leaps forward to Apollo 4.
And after a couple more uncrewed flights, we get to Apollo 7, which was the first mission to actually have a crew. And then, of course, the one everybody on the planet knows, Apollo 11. So the numbering is pretty much what you'd expect, except for that huge glaring hole right at the very beginning.
Right, so the key thing to get here is that this isn't just some typo in a history book. The reality of how the Apollo missions were numbered is so much more complex and honestly way more revealing than a simple 1, 2, 3 could ever be. It's a real story of trial, of error, and of some incredible courage. So to solve this whole mystery, we actually have to go back in time and look at the missions that happened before the missions. See, before NASA was ever going to strap astronauts on top of those gigantic rockets, they absolutely had to run a whole series of supercritical, high-stakes, uncrewed tests. And those early flights, they had totally different names.
Okay, let's start with this one, AS-201. This flight, way back in February 1966, was the very first time the Apollo Command Module ever flew on a Saturn rocket. It was just a short up-and-down suborbital flight, but it was absolutely essential for testing things like propulsion, guidance, and of course the heat shield during re-entry.
Then, just a few months later, they launched AS-202. This one was an even tougher test. It pushed the spacecraft way harder, with longer engine burns and a much more demanding re-entry. Now, both of these missions gave them priceless data, but you know what? They also found some really serious problems. And this is the bottom line, the huge takeaway from those tests. Even with all the pressure from the public and the race against the Soviet Union, the engineers knew the truth. The Apollo spacecraft just wasn't safe enough yet for astronauts, period. But that pressure to keep moving forward was just immense. The next step was already planned, the first crew test of the spacecraft, just flying in Earth orbit. And this mission would lead to a moment of just absolute tragedy that would stop the entire program in its tracks and change everything that came after it. On January 27, 1967, during what was supposed to be a routine launch rehearsal right there on the pad, a fire erupted inside the command module. This wasn't a launch, you have to remember. It was just a ground test. But in a split second, the mission turned into an absolute catastrophe. It was just this lethal combination of factors. First, the cabin was filled with a pure, highly pressurized oxygen environment. A single spark, which then found all this flammable material like Velcro and nylon, turned into an inferno. And to make it all so much worse, the hatch was designed to open inward, and the intense pressure from that fire sealed it completely shut. Tragically, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were lost. This absolutely devastating event forced NASA to re-evaluate the entire Apollo program from top to bottom. And it's right here in how NASA responded to that fire that we find the answer to our original question about the missing Apollo 2. In the aftermath, NASA made a really important decision. To honor the lives and the ultimate sacrifice of the crew, they officially designated that tragic mission as Apollo 1. This was to make sure that their mission would forever be remembered as the first of the entire program. And here it is. This is the key. NASA chose not to go back and retroactively rename those earlier uncrewed test flights AS-201 and AS-202 as Apollo 2 and 3. Instead, they decided to reserve the Apollo numbering for the new, redesigned, much safer program that would follow the tragedy. And just like that, they created that permanent gap in the sequence. So the program was basically reborn with safety as the absolute #1 priority. The entire command module was redesigned. That pure oxygen atmosphere on the launch pad, gone, replaced with a much safer nitrogen-oxygen mix. All the flammable stuff was ripped out and replaced with fire-resistant materials. And most critically, that hatch was totally redesigned so it could open outward in less than 5 seconds. With all these changes in place, the program carefully, methodically returned to flight. The very next mission was named Apollo 4. That was the first ever test of the gigantic Saturn V rocket. Then came Apollo 6, another uncrewed test. And then finally, in October 1968, Apollo 7 carried the first crew into orbit since the fire, proving that the redesigned spacecraft was safe, it was effective, the path to the moon was open again. So you see, Apollo 2 is kind of a ghost mission. It never flew, it was never officially named. But the story behind this missing number is incredibly important. It's so much more than just a piece of trivia, it's a really vital part of the whole Apollo story. The absence of Apollo 2 isn't some error or some kind of cover-up. No, it's a deliberate, respectful symbol that was left right there in the historical record. It's this quiet testament to a really difficult but transformative period in space exploration. That gap reminds us of so many things. The hidden, uncrewed tests like AS201 that laid the groundwork, the immense, always present risks of this kind of adventure, and most importantly, the painful but absolutely critical lessons that they learned from failure and the incredible resilience it took to ultimately succeed. You know, this really sums it all up perfectly. The path to the moon was not a straight line. It was full of setbacks and major course corrections. The story of what isn't there, that missing Apollo 2, is every bit as crucial to understanding the achievement as the story of Apollo 11. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The missing Apollo mission is this powerful reminder that behind every huge success, there are so often unseen tests, uncelebrated steps, and really painful lessons learned along the way. It kind of makes you wonder, what's the story behind the other things we don't see?